Hello everybody, welcome to Catherine Sews. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I want to teach you how to make your own skirt sloper. It's just the basic pattern, like a basic block that you can then make any design you want from. I'm going to link here and below a video I did quite a while ago about the 5 skills you need for pattern drafting. And from there, it really opens up the world to you of making any skirt design that you want to. So I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm just going to take you through how to easily draft your own skirt block based on just 3 measurements and very little math. And then I'm going to cut mine out in cotton muslin and sew it up, check the fit, correct my pattern, and then I'll have a pattern for next week's video where I'll be cutting out a simple A-line skirt on the bias. I made a video a couple weeks ago about using bias in fashion design, and a few people said, well, how do I actually lay that out and cut it? And so I thought, okay, perfect. I will make a bias skirt for the next video. The measurements you're going to need are your waist, your hip, and the distance between the two. So the waist is the smallest part where you bend, where your belly button is. The hip is the fullest part. And I like to turn to the side so I can see in the mirror the fullest part of the measurement. And then the hip depth is just from your waist down to that hip measurement. So just those 3 measurements and then we're ready to go. So after you take your measurements, you're going to need some kind of white paper. You can use the back of wrapping paper, art paper, but a big piece of white paper will do. And then you're going to need a long meter stick. I like a metal one like this. And I love using these 2-inch wide see-through rulers. Those are very handy, as is the Variform curve rule. This is also handy. You can get by with other rulers and other curves, but these are my favorite tools. So there are links in the description box to these tools. One other tool that's handy, but again, you can live without it, is the pointed tracing wheel. And that's also in the description box. You'll also need a sharp pencil. I'm going to do mine in a Sharpie so you can see, but definitely a pencil is better. So I'm going to start by drawing a rectangle that is half of my total hip measurement. So my hip is 40.5 inches. I want to add 2 inches of wearing ease, like just so that you can bend and sit and move in the skirt. So I'm adding 2 inches, so that gives me 42.5. But my rectangle is only going to be half of that. So divide that in 2 gives me 21.25. And then the length of my rectangle will be just sort of a standard pencil skirt length. So for me, probably 22 inches is good. A big wide ruler like this is useful for making right angles, or if you have a T-square or an L-square. I've got my cutting mat under here so I can see the lines through there as well. Good. Okay, the next line I want is a line that is my hip depth. So when I measured the distance from my waist to my hip, I got 8 inches. Okay, so that is my hip height. So this line over here is the center back. Over here is the center front. Now I want to draw what would be the side seam. So I'm going to draw mine exactly in the middle. So 21.5. So that's half of 21.5. 10.75. So this is the side seam. All we need to do now is figure out how much smaller I want this to be at the waist compared to the hip. I put 2 inches of ease on the hip, but I don't want any ease at the waist. Some people like to have still about ½ an inch of ease at the waist. I prefer it to just be exactly my waist measurement. So my hip, including the ease, is 42.5 inches. My waist is 32.5 inches. So the difference is 10 inches in the whole circumference, right? But we're only drawing half. I need to divide that into a back dart, side seam, and front dart. And there's a little formula you can use that makes it pretty easy. The side seam takes up the most of that difference. It's going to get half of that 10 inches. And so that equals 5 inches we'll be taking off the side seam. The back dart gets the next biggest amount, and it gets 1/3. Now we don't have to be precise on the fraction. Like I don't need to say 1/3 of 10 is 3.3 inches. I'm gonna just call it 3 inches. Where we need to be precise is that this third number needs to take us up to 10. So the front dart gets 1/5 of the total. And so 1/5 of 10 inches is 2 inches. So 5 plus 3 plus 2 equals 10 inches. And 10 inches is quite a common difference between waist and hip. These are my numbers for the whole circumference though, right? But there are 2 side seams, right and a left. There are 2 back darts and 2 front darts. So for each side seam, I want to take half of that. So 2.5 inches, and 1.5 inches goes into the back dart, and 1 inch into the front dart. Good. If the difference between your waist and hip is more than 10 inches, that's when you want to get into doing a double dart, especially at the back. You don't want a dart that's bigger than 1.5 inches. If this number for your back dart is bigger than 1.5 inches, divide it into 2 and make 2 smaller darts. So for that side seam, I'm taking off 2.5 inches, so 1.25 off each side of that side seam. So there's 1.25 and 1.25. And then with my hip curve, I want to just find a curve that just flows gently from that point right to where my hip line meets the side seam. So about there is good. And I've got 14.5 at the top here. I'm going to flip and get 14.5 at the top here as well so that the curves match. I'm going to actually extend that line up a little bit like that, okay? We'll come back to that measurement. And now let's do the back dart. So I want the back dart about halfway in between there. And I'm going to make this back dart come down about halfway to my hip. So for me, that would be about 4 inches. Okay. And the size of my back dart is 1.5 inches total. And so I want 3/4 of an inch on either side of that line. 1.5 inches there. Okay. And then I can just draw straight lines to my dart point. Good. Okay. And in the front, just about the same, but the dart is just a little shorter. So there's the center of my dart. And I'm just going to make this one about 3 inches long. Okay, and the width of this one is just 1 inch, so I'll put 1/2 inch on either side of that line. And straight lines down to the point. Good. So now there's just a few little small details we need to take care of. We need to have right angles at our side seams here. If I go up about 1/2 inch, I can have a nice right angle coming down there. Okay, so we've got it going up a little bit on the side, and then we want to just bring it down a little bit at the center back. But again, I want a right angle there. And now I want to blend right through from the center back to the side seam. Now this line at the dart is going to change when we're going to be folding this pattern to find the peak of the dart there. Okay, good, almost there. So this is now the draft of my sloper. It's not usable as a pattern yet, and I don't want to cut this up. Just in case I have changes I need to make, I want to be able to come back to this. What I need to do is trace off both of these into 2 separate pieces. So this is the back, that's the front. I want them to be separated. Hopefully with your paper you can see through it well enough. I can see through this nicely. And I want to trace these off with some space in between so that I can add seam allowance to both. I want a notch at the hip. I'll slide my paper over so I have room in between. And then trace off the back. To be able to fold this dart, I need to start with a horizontal fold that goes right across the point. So I crease that and then unfold it. Now I'm going to fold on the arm that's closer to the center. This is my center back here. So fold on that arm of the dart, crease it, and then unfold it again. Go back to that first fold, and now I can close up the dart. I'm going to bring this arm over to the other arm. Good. And then you can see that my line is a bit wonky. So I want to smooth out that line, and then I want to go over it with my pointed tracing wheel, just like that. And then that shows me the height of the dart. And it's not very peaky. Same thing on the front. Horizontal fold, crease and unfold. So I fold on the arm of the dart that's closer to the center, crease and unfold, back to that horizontal fold, and bring this arm of the dart over to that arm. Make my curve a little smoother, and then mark it with the pointed tracing wheel. There, so now you can see a better peak there. You can see this comes up to there and down to there. Good. Okay, let's add seam allowance. For the center front, place on fold. I won't be adding seam allowance to the center front. I'm just going to add it to the top and the side seam. I'm not even going to add a hem here because I don't know what length I'm going to end up wanting from my design. So let me show you how I just use a see-through ruler like this to add my seam allowance. I just use the 1/2 inch line. I put that 1/2 inch line right along my seam line and trace. When I get up into a curve, I just need to pivot my ruler along, and I pivot along as I trace. I can extend that hip notch out. Now you might not want to add seam allowance to yours. You might want to keep it as a sloper that you can do all your designing with. For me, I want to just be able to use it as a pencil skirt pattern, and I can still make any changes I want to it. I just find it so much more convenient to have the seam allowance on. But technically a sloper is not supposed to have seam allowance. I want to extend up the arms of the dart and have a little notch at the top of the seam allowance there and there. And I can also put a notch at the seam allowance. You might prefer to give yourself a much bigger seam allowance, like a good inch on the side seam for fitting purposes, like just so you have that extra just in case. I might get to the sewing and not remember what I did, and so it's kind of nice to have that notch that marks your seam allowance. On the center back, I actually do want a bigger seam allowance because I want to be able to put a zipper down there. When I'm sewing a center back zipper, I like to have 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. So now I definitely want that seam allowance notch just to remind myself, yep, there's a bigger seam allowance there. Good. And then I'll give myself a double notch at the depth of a skirt zipper, which is usually about 7 inches. 2 notches indicates the back. So I have to now test this out. I have to cut this out of an unbleached muslin, and then I can sew it up. Okay, so I've cut it out of muslin. You can use anything. You can use an old sheet or any ugly fabric that you're never going to use for anything else. It's just basically it's just for testing out the pattern, so it does not have to be beautiful. So I've snipped the ends of the dart and marked the point with a Sharpie. So I'll bring those 2 notches together and point a pin toward them. Fold it right on that point and put a pin sideways. All 4 just like that. I like the fold of the dart to be on my right. And on the back, I just need to make sure I make 2 opposites. Okay, and then let's head to the sewing machine. And then I'll sew side seams. and then the center back seam just from that double notch down, and at that bigger 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm just looking at the time, and sewing up this muslin literally took me 4 minutes and 43 seconds. So it's so worth doing, because now I'll have a lot more confidence in the fit of this. I'm going to take it to the iron, press everything, and then try it on inside out. I have just a little extra room in the hip, which is about equal to the ease that I added. I don't really want it super tight though, because if I pull it tight, that just emphasizes my tummy, which I don't want. But I also have to consider the fabric I'm going to use. If I don't have any stretch in my fabric, I'm definitely going to want to keep some of that ease. But if I have stretch in the fabric, then I'm okay without it. So let me show you how I'm just going to alter the pattern to fit a little better over the hip. So I just sewed from pin to pin, and then I tried it on again and made sure I was happy. And now I'm going to line it back up with the pattern. And then with my pointed tracing wheel, I'm going to trace the new sewing line. So here's my new sewing line. And then I'll add seam allowance back on top of that line. And then I'll be taking the same amount off the front and the back. So I'll pin those together to make sure they stay nicely lined up and trim off the excess. So this now is just the perfect little pencil skirt for me, or I can manipulate this in any of the ways that I'll link to the pattern drafting video in the description box. Okay, so that wasn't too hard, was it? That went pretty quickly, pretty easily. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you back here next time on Catherine Sews. And until then, you take care.